Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Electricity Association's Conversation webinar series. My name is Farhan Mirza, and I'll be your host for today's session. CEA is the voice of the electricity industry in Canada. I would like to begin by first acknowledging that the land on which I'm broadcasting you from today is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. I would also like to recognize Canada as the land of the First Peoples, Inuit and Métis. I would like to pay homage to the Indigenous peoples of past, present, and future that continue to work, educate, and contribute to the strength of our country. I would like to recognize that the land is shared through historic treaties, developed through contemporary treaties, and one that continues to be unceded territory. The Conversation series features presentations from CEA's corporate partners, and the series will highlight a variety of Canadian and international solutions to current and future challenges faced by our industry. Working with CEA's corporate partners, these webinars have been developed to be of specific interest to those working in the electric utility space, from generation through to the customer. For a list of upcoming sessions, please check out Canadian Electricity Association's website at electricity.ca. Before we get going, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to go over. Our session today is scheduled to go from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and questions can be asked, and we'd encourage you to do so as they come to mind by typing them into the chat function, or the questions function, I should say, on the side of your screen. We will ask them as they come up at the end of the presentation. Also, a brief survey will be sent out to webinar participants following the session today, and we very much appreciate your candid feedback and are interested in hearing about any topics that you'd like to have included in the conversation series in the future. Lastly, please keep an eye out for future webinars and events through CEA's monthly newsletter called Current Affairs. With over 6,000 subscribers, Current Affairs, much like the national newspaper, is the place to go for Canadian industry news as we connect the national value chain from generation through to the customer. If you'd like to receive Current Affairs, you can subscribe to this free publication on CEA's website, again at electricity.ca. Moving on to today's session. Joining us on the Conversation series, I'd like to welcome OMICRON Energy, who will be presenting on cybersecurity and substations. The frequency and intensity of cyber attacks targeting the power grid have increased since the first confirmed blackout caused by hackers in the Ukraine in 2016. Substations represent a critical attack vector within the power grid, commonly located in remote locations, unmanned and visited infrequently by a transient workforce. Increasingly compromised of contractors in the substation land presents unique challenges not found in traditional IT and OT networks. Gateways and firewalls located in the substation land perimeter cannot prevent the transmission of unauthorized network traffic within the cyber defense perimeter. Today's webinar will go over a paper that presents a new approach to this intrusion detection within the IEC 61850 substation. And to take us through today's session, I'd like to welcome Steele McCreary, the Utility Communications Application Engineer at OMICRON. Steele, welcome to the Conversation series. I will turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you very much, Fran, for the introduction, and thank everyone else for joining. Today, I'd like to first start with just a quick mention of my company. OMICRON was founded over 30 years ago in a small town in Austria. They set out to develop compact test sets for testing protection and measurement devices within the electrical utilities. From a small group of dedicated engineers, we've grown into an international company. We have 24 offices worldwide and customers in over 160 cities. We manufacture both primary test equipment to test large devices such as generators, motors, and transformers, in addition to secondary test equipment to test protective relaying equipment. I'd also like to encourage you to consider joining us at the 6th Annual Canadian Protection Symposium from November 30th to December 2nd. As part of the symposium on the morning of November 30th, I will be hosting a tutorial with SEL on cybersecurity, focused on the complementary features of a functional security monitoring intrusion detection system in concert with software-defined networking. It promises to be a very interesting tutorial. And as I start this presentation, I would like to mention that this presentation is really designed for protective relaying engineers those that may not necessarily be that familiar with all the aspects of cybersecurity. And so we're going to kind of start from the bottom and build ourselves up. What we'll take a look at is some cyber attacks that we can learn from that have specifically targeted the operational technology networks such as substations and industrial facilities. We'll then look at how to protect substations against cyber attacks through a review of some principles, the first being the defense in depth principle, and then the NIST framework. And we will look at how we identify electrical utility substation cyber attack vectors, how we would protect the most critical attack vectors, typically the remote access and control center links, and then how we would detect threats with an intrusion detection system. We'll talk about traditional intrusion detection systems, such as signature-based and learning-based intrusion detection systems, before moving on to a functional security monitoring intrusion detection system and its features and its strengths in this environment. And finally, we'll take a look at how we respond with an IDS and how it is integrated into the substation. If there is time, which I believe there should be in this particular presentation, I'll actually have a live demonstration that I'd like to go through with you. So when we talk about cyber attacks in the substation, let's take a look at some successful, in a lot of cases, state-sponsored, or we suspect state-sponsored cyber attacks that have already been performed. Of course, the most famous that we can talk about is the 2010 Iran Stuxnet attack, where PLCs were infected through engineering PCs that were occasionally attached to the PLC programming ports. In 2015, we had the first known attack on the power grid. This attack used infected control center PCs. The attackers remotely controlled the PCs to perform switching operations, and then the RTUs were also infected and destroyed to create further damage. This attack affected over 230,000 people who were without power, electrical power, for periods of time from 1 to 6 hours. In 2016, the second attack on the Ukraine, but this time it was the first attack on Ukraine's power system, but this time it was the first attack on an actual substation itself. And the malware contained not only IT malware that had been traditionally used in the past, but it also contained malware for protocols, the 104 protocol, the 101 protocol, and the IEC 61850 protocols. And they were actual modules. So it was a very sophisticated piece of software. In addition to that, it had OPC data access malware. And as we can see from this diagram, it also had basically an event log. And basically what the malware did is in the case of 101 and 104, it looked for double bit control, and these would be the control that would be used to operate breakers. In the case of IEC 61850 devices, the malware would scan the IED if it had an IEC 61850 model and look for something called a logical node, CSWI, and that particular logical node would control the circuit breakers. And what the software then did is it tried to manipulate those breakers, and we can see from the event log that it was successful in the case of some of the double points to operate the breakers. So a very, very sophisticated attack. This particular attack, it's clear that they were in the substation for a period of time crafting the attack before they launched the attack. And the key is that when hackers are inside the substation looking around or probing around, they're generating transmissions which can be detected. Some further attacks. In the Middle East, there was the Triton attack. In the Triton attack, the PLCs were manipulated, and these PLCs controlled the plant safety systems and emergency shutdown system. It was clear that it could have been created a lot of damage, but thankfully the PLC systems, it was a redundant system. It actually detected there was an issue, and it actually sequenced itself down without a problem. More recently, we've had some ransomware attacks. In 2019, the ECANS ransomware that killed OT applications. And also in 2019, in December, the Rhinoc ransomware attack that targeted oil and gas utilities and their HMIs. In Northwest Territories, we had a ransomware attack that targeted IT systems, affecting most operations. And of course, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware cyber attack that impacted the pipeline operations themselves. So these are examples of attack, and again, they're growing in frequency and seem to be growing in intensity. And so we need to take action. We need to protect the substations. So how do you secure and how do you protect a substation against cyber attacks? Well, there are some very good principles and models that we can look to as guidance. One of the most common principles across all regulations worldwide is the concept of defense in depth, which is present everywhere. It's basically it recommends not just one hard shell around your substation, but multiple layers of defense that are cascaded to each other. So if one fails, not all is lost. Think of it as an onion with multiple layers of defense, such that no one can get into the core without going through multiple layers. For example, a physical barrier such as fences, locks around the substation exterior. And then once you get inside the substation onto the network, there's network segmentation to reduce the attack surface, role-based access to make it more difficult to get into the devices themselves, and updates, frequent updates, and secure protocols wherever possible. So again, multiple layers. But in concert with that principle is the defense. The principle of defense in depth is the NIST framework, which was introduced or set forth by the National Institute of Standards and Technologies under the United States Commerce Department. And the NIST cybersecurity framework is a set of guidelines for private sector companies to follow to better be prepared to identify, detect, and respond to cyber attacks. This framework has been adopted in many national security regulations throughout the world. The NIST framework is really based on a holistic approach to cybersecurity, focused on the interaction of people, processes, and technology. The framework is continuously updated. The latest version, 1.1, was published in 2018. And the core assumption of this framework is that there is no 100% protection. Attacks can always come through your defense. Security is seen as a process of 5 steps. The first step is to identify the attack vectors. This parallels NERC-CIP 2. Identify your risks for a cyber attack, identify your vulnerabilities. And the second step is to protect against the vectors with the highest risk, which again, NERC-CIP 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now that you've protected against these attacks or attack vectors, detect threats and prohibitive activities as they occur, CIP 8. Again, this allows you to minimize the damage by detecting the attacks as they're occurring and learn from these attacks. Of course, you would respond to the detected threats to minimize the damage, and then you would recover the affected services, learn and adjust your cybersecurity posture to better engage the continuously evolving threat landscape. And it's a continuous process that it's involved with. And we see it implemented all over the world. So with these two principles, let's take a look at our substation. So how are we going to protect your substation? Well, we first need to reduce the attack surface of our crown jewels, which are the intelligent electronic devices, the small computers that are inside the substation that are actually running the substation itself. You need to protect those devices. And the job is to eliminate the attack vectors where possible and make the remaining attack vectors more difficult, i.e. the probability of use. So to do this, we first need to know the attack vectors within a substation. Now, when I'm talking to different customers, they normally present this diagram to me, a connection to the central control center through a gateway to the substation network, and then the devices themselves. Upon further probing, many times there is the acknowledgement that there is a temporary or a permanent remote access to the corporate IT LAN. Of course, this is a very large attack vector, the largest of all of the attack vectors, and it has been used in many attacks in the past. The most frequent, it is the most frequent used, and for example, in the case of the Ukraine cyber attack in 2016 and the Triton cyber attack on PLC infrastructure in 2016. Another attack vector can be through the control center, as we saw in the first Ukraine attack, where firmware the gateway devices were destroyed. Another entry point is through the engineering PCs that are temporarily connected to the IEDs, as we saw in the Stuxnet attack. And of course, the testing laptops that are often directly connected to the network itself, the LAN network itself, so they're also a potential source to infect the IEDs. And for this reason, the new IEC 61850 test tools are available, and test sets are available to basically isolate the testing PC from the LAN, so you don't make a direct connection to the LAN, you actually go through this testing device itself. And of course, the testing device itself has to be hardened by the manufacturers to make it very difficult for the hackers to try to exploit that device. Setting files can also be and documentation files can also be sources of attacks, and so they should really be isolated and protected in the data management system. Now, in addition to the actual attack vectors themselves, you need to be aware of the actual current components and their properties within your substation. Why? Because the security advisories about the substation devices are published frequently, and basically with those advisories, if you know the type of device you have and the firmware of that device, then under a certain network setup, you could in fact be vulnerable. And so you should have a running list of this information. How hard is it to attack a protective relay or an IED within the substation? Well, this is an actual example of vulnerability that has been exploited. This vulnerability is well known, and it's of an old firmware of a certain vendor. This vendor is a market leader for protective relays. For vulnerable relays, only one packet needs to be crafted and sent to the relay to crash the relay. That is, all the communication stops, the protective relay functions stop working until the next time the relay is rebooted. This means that if there's, for example, an overcurrent fault, this relay would not trip. It only requires 3 lines of Python code to send such a packet. You can Google it to find out more information on it. But secure patches have been available since 2015, so the question is why wasn't this device updated? Well, within the substation, patch management is very difficult. The IEDs are tested intensely for an extended period of time to ensure that everything operates under different electrical conditions appropriately. And if you were to update the firmware in a particular device, you would have to retest the system. this means that you need to take an outage on the substation. And this becomes very costly, in some cases extremely impractical to do. And so regular patch management in the substation typically isn't that done, which means to say you have to really design for cybersecurity attacks, because these devices are at risk. So how do you establish this list of devices within the substation? We can do it manually, but there's potential for miss unexpected devices. There's passive discovery, where you can look at the network cards, but really all you do is get IP addresses and services that are used. Firmware version is not among the things that you can detect. You can use active discovery, for example, in digital substations, IEC 61850 substations, which is the focus of this discussion. You can use MMS reads and writes and take a look at the nameplate information, which gives you the type of device and the model number information. And you can also take a look at the configuration files, what they call the SCL files, which will have also firmware information in them. And this is a report, for example, that was generated and automatically by actually the IDS, Functional Security Monitoring IDS. And basically, it'll show you the device name, the firmware, IP address, MAC address, model number, this sort of information. And it's created. It's continuously scanning the devices and updating this. So this is an important piece. Going back to protect, how do you protect the remote access link that I mentioned before as being the largest surface of attack? Well, basically what you need to do is to basically have a separate substation IT with a separate services and within the substation. This is called a demilitarized zone. And the services are only accessible from the substation via a secure limited access link from the IT office to basically a virtual machine that's sitting in this DMZ, and the virtual machine inside the DMZ will actually be connected to the substation LAN. This separate substation IT network is called, as I mentioned, the DMZ, and to gain access to it, as I said, you would go through a limited secure access point. Typically, you would have some sort of token to log in. That token may not necessarily be with you. You may, during the login from the IT, from the T network, you may need to call to the control center, and they would potentially give you the tokens that you can complete the login. That way you have multiple eyes looking at the login into the substation, and you're not, then you can do your work basically through the virtual machine. So that isolates the substation network from the office network. And again, it's a temporary connection that is of course you sign out of. In addition to that, we have to talk about the control center to the station bus itself. Typically, they'll go through some sort of RTU, and in many cases, you don't just have the typical control protocols such as DMP 101 and 104 or MMS. You would have additional protocols, and in many cases, there isn't a firewall present, and so we recommend that, for example, in the 215 Ukraine attack, there wasn't a firewalls there, and your RTUs are manipulated and destroyed. So we recommend a firewall between the control center and the RTU, and also between the RTU and the station bus. But in addition to that, we should be monitoring the traffic on the network. And so how do you secure the local network traffic is really key here. And again, as I mentioned before, the attack can potentially be through the PC or the protocol gateway. You reduce the attack surface by segregating the network. So you might have a management network, a station bus network, a process bus network. Technical options are physical or virtual LANs, access control lists in security appliances. The switches may only accept frames from previously learned MAC addresses. Software-defined networking is another method rather than standard switches, which just move traffic based on trust. SDN is denied by fault. You have to actually describe the frames to the SDN switches accurately, or you program them accurately ahead of time, and they then only pass those frames that have been basically configured to pass. Now, detection. The detection is the next piece. So now we've actually segregated the network. We need to actually be monitoring that network. And history has shown often that the attacks are prepared for a long time. They're generating noise inside the substation. Given enough time, attackers we just have to assume attackers will come in or getting access to the substation. So we actually have to be able to detect this traffic. The way this is done is by basically connecting up an intrusion detection system. The best way of connecting up to sort of most critical points would be the connections that go off to the gateway. So that's important to be monitoring those particular points, but also monitor through mirrored ports the communications downstream, down in the process bus. But the key is the communication on the station bus going through the gateway, the back and forth communication here. And we want to monitor that with an intrusion detection system. Now, let's talk about the different types of traffic within the substation. You have the fast, high-speed, real-time services, such as Goose messaging, generic object-oriented substation event messaging, and that's typically, unless it needs, the latency there is typically under 3 milliseconds, so encryption is not really an option. You also have sampled values, which are actually require even lower latency, typically a couple of hundred microseconds. And in addition to that, you have the slow speed traffic, the client server traffic, the configuration information, supervision information that you would see inside the substation, and control center to SCADA type communication. And all this communication needs to be monitored. And in the past, the traditional intrusion detection systems were one of two types. One was called the signature-based intrusion detection system. It's kind of like a PC's antivirus, where it has a signature. It looks for, from past attacks, certain signatures of an attack, and then alarms. The problem with this sort of approach is that there haven't been many attacks on substations. And so a new attack will probably take on a new signature. And so the IDS would not recognize the attack, or would not be aware of the attack. And so the IDS needs to be able to detect an intrusion without having prior knowledge. And so then we move over to the learning-based or artificial intelligence-based intrusion detection system. And this particular type of intrusion detection system basically monitors the network for a period of time. It goes through a learning process, and it monitors the network for a period of time, and it looks at frequency and timing of certain protocol markers to attempt to learn the usual behavior of the traffic within the substation. And once this learning phase has been completed, the IDS monitoring the traffic goes into what we call the online mode, and it'll raise an alarm if one of these markers is significantly outside the expected range. Now, the main issue with this approach is that there is valid but infrequent traffic scenarios that may take place, such as valid but infrequent switching operations, maintenance operations, and in fact, some sort of a protection operation that causes a trip that generates traffic. And so it would alarm on this, but it's not just that it would alarm an infrequent traffic, but it's the nature by which these alarms are reported. These systems don't really understand the semantics of the protocol, and so the alarm messages are expressed in terms of technical protocol detail. Hence, the alarms can only be examined by the engineer skilled in IEC 61850 protocol. details and familiar with IT network security. The engineer examining alarm must also know about the operation of the system to judge if certain IEC 61850 protocol events correspond to a valid behavior. If they do, then more time has to be taken to detune the system for this type of traffic in the future. This all takes time, and it's labor intensive, and there's a lot of substations, and there tends to be a lot of this infrequent traffic, which tends to lend itself to these being alarms to eventually being ignored. So these two have not really been successful in the OT environment. There is a new approach in the IEC 61850 substation. The whole automation system, including all of the IEDs, their data models, and their communication patterns, is described in a standard format. It's called the substation configuration language and the associated files with it. This information, if ingested into a functional security monitoring IDS, can generate a very precise model of the traffic that should be in the substation and the frequency of that traffic and what should be in the payload. So you can, the IDS has a capability of doing extremely deep packet inspection. It can, but it can go further than that. You can augment it with the ability to add third-party devices such as test PCs and give those PCs certain roles within the substation, and allow what we call maintenance type modes of operation. 98% of the traffic within the digital substation is described within the IEC 61850 files, and so this allows for a very, very precise model. And again, what we're talking about is examining the data, the packets from layer 2 all the way up to the payload itself. Now, let me give you an example here. This is actually an alarm that is shown using this sort of IDS. And the first thing we see is that you'll get a visual picture of the substation, the IEDs in the substation, the voltage ledger of the substation, the individual, as I said, IEDs, the role of third-party device. In this case, it's a test PC. This vertical line represents an alarm, and this information is gleaned or taken from the SCL files itself, the substation section of the SCL files themselves, and the alarm itself is in the language of the protection engineer. In this particular case, this alarm has come because the IDS is saying, hey, this test PC is trying to do some sort of operation, it's trying to control the breaker. The test PC can talk to the devices under certain conditions, but it shouldn't necessarily do some sort of control operation. That's not normal. But in addition to that, it has the capability, the functional security monitoring IDS, of actually diagnose additional problems. For example, it could take a look at the high-speed generic object-oriented substation event messages. This is these peer-to-peer messages or goose messages, I refer to them, and take a look and see that, hey, the configuration revision is different than what it should be. So this goose message has, the configuration is different. That's payload information. Or it's got the wrong VLAN. Okay, wrong as compared to what it should be used. So maybe the wrong destination MAC. So maybe there's been an additional goose message, there's been a modification, and all these alarms will be displayed. But it'll also detect an unknown goose message, that one that wasn't described in the actual configuration file. Something's tried to potentially inject an additional goose message. Switching commands, as I mentioned earlier, there could be a synchronization issue. So when a goose message is sent out, there's what is called an entry time assigned to the goose message when it enters the network. And this entry time can be compared by the IDS to the time it actually is received at the IDS. And if there's a there's a large discrepancy between the two timestamps, then the IDS knows there's some sort of timing issue with this IED. So this is going beyond just detecting what traffic that shouldn't be there. It's actually detecting functional problems. That's because the model, the communication model that the IDS is using is so precise. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop for a moment and I'm going to this presentation here, and I'm going to attempt to bring up my Station Guard. It's the name of our IDS, Functional Security Monitoring IDS. You can see I have a bunch of devices over here. That's these devices with little question marks on them. Let me very quickly explain my lab setup. What I have is I've got the Station Guard system, the intrusion detection system, and it's connected up to a device here, this little computer. And this little computer is simulating all of the traffic that would be in a small substation. It's generating that traffic and sending that traffic, a copy of that traffic, over to the IDS. And I've got a little keyboard here that I can actually program this computer to send non-valid traffic. So let's program the intrusion detection system. So we're actually going to configure it. So this has been just reset back to factory defaults, and I'm just going to reset it again so you can see that. So it's just back to factory defaults, and it's detecting all of these devices. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure it by importing the SEL file. And now what I've done is I've configured all of these IEDs. Notice that it actually has put the IEDs at different voltage level in addition to other types of equipment that have been configured within the SEL file. But in addition to that, there's this other device. So this other device is my computer. So I'm just going to click on the device, and I'm going to give it a role of testing PC. There, its role is testing PC, and I'm going to give it the name Steel. And I'm going to apply this. Now, my testing PC will actually be a couple alarms that come up because my testing PC tends to want to call back to the office every now and again. But so there's the first alarm from it calling back to the office. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow that, okay? Key here is that I didn't actually have to create the rule. It saw some traffic, and I just know what this traffic is, and that it's not invalid traffic. It's just traffic that my PC sends to the office. And what's happened is I was able to very easily, it actually creates the rule for you. It says, hey, do you want this traffic? If so, I've created a rule for it, and I just accepted that rule. And it did it again, and this time I'm going to go a little bit slower because there's two types of traffic that the computer generates. So I'll just go down here to this little plus sign here, and it says this is the sort of traffic, gives a description of it. It's the UDP traffic, and it's a port 17 in this particular case. And I'm just going to allow this traffic and then accept it. And now in the future, it won't alarm on that traffic, rather than having to create a whole pile of rules. So this is very friendly to the protection engineer, and that's a necessity for substations, is that it can be implemented easily by the protection engineer. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate some alarms here. First alarm, you can see down here if I click on it. This particular alarm is that you restarted a goose message. So the goose message is just restarted. There's a sequence and state number, and it can tell that these goose messages have just restarted from this device. We look examining the sequence and state number. What I can also do here is I can have a second alarm, and that particular alarm down here is basically what's this one? Oh, yeah, a goose multicast goose message. Again, it was just restarted. So we'll just escape from that one and apply that. And we'll do another one here. And in this particular case, we've got, you can see that there's a synchronization error. So there's a synchronization error, the time in which the goose message was received at the IDS. The time is a lot longer than what it should be, and so it's saying, hey, there's some sort of synchronization issue with this particular device. So these are examples of functional alarms. Now what I'll do is I will actually call up another piece of software. This would be a testing piece of software. It's called ID Scout. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to discover one of the IEDs. And as soon as I discover it, start reading that IED, I'm not in what we call a maintenance mode. And so it says, hey, this computer is talking to this device. And this computer is a testing PC. It shouldn't normally be talking to this device. So what we'll do is we'll go into the maintenance mode here. As soon as we do that, the alarm will go away. It says, okay, we're in maintenance mode, so this maintenance PC can talk to this device. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something that's illegal, or it's something that'll generate an alarm. I'm going to go down to one of the switchgear controllers, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and control it. So I'm going to select and then operate, and as soon as I do that, again, it comes up with an alarm here, a switching operation from this device. Very, very, very visual alarms in the language of the substation engineer, not in protocol detail. Very easy to discern. And now let's go back to the presentation. This particular type of IDS, there's other protocols that we're now supporting with it, and we're going to deeper packet inspection with DNP and Modbus, some of these other protocols to make sure that we're not just using what they call the port number, but it's actually the protocol is actually, there's characteristics of the protocol, other characteristics we look at to make sure that they're not trying to do some sort of attack through DNP or Modbus or FTP, some sort of buffer overflow attack, that in fact these protocols are actually being used by the devices and they're doing the appropriate actions within the substation that one would expect. Finally, how do you integrate the IDS into the system to allow for response? And we can integrate the IDS typically through what we call syslog to the enterprise SOC, the security operations center, or we have contacts that we could close that are wired up to an IED of a point that's being monitored by the SCADA system. We also have plugins to allow it to go to a ticketing system, very sophisticated ways of integrating, such that the operators and the maintenance personnel can respond, and of course the IT department, security department can respond appropriately to these types of alarms. And so I'm looking at my time here. It's 42 minutes into the presentation, and at this point I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. And I guess, Fran, I'll ask you to come in and moderate those questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that great presentation and that demonstration, Steele. Very, very insightful, I'm sure, for a lot of the folks in the audience. Steele mentioned, feel free to type in your questions into the questions window on the right, and I will ask them of Steele as they come in. Steele, just to maybe kick things off a little bit, maybe you could talk about, what is the most common attack vector for substations?
The most common attack vector that we've seen by far is temporary or typically permanent connections from the IT network into the substation. Why? Because this is where the phishing attacks occur. You've got a large corporate attack surface, and this is where attackers are going to try to get in. In the case of the 2015 Ukraine attack, there was an attachment to an email that talked about raises, and then what happened, obviously people want to open that up, and they opened it up in the control center on those PCs, and it infected those PCs. So that came right through the IT department. So you really got to control that particular attack vector. Good question.
Awesome, thanks, Steele. All right, we have another question that's come in. Could you discuss some more about the requirements for getting data visible to the IDS? How much of the substation traffic should be made visible, and is it practical to have all visible traffic?
Very good question. The most important traffic is the traffic going through to the gateway. In the case of this particular IDS, it has 8 ports on it, and so what you can do is you can use a mirrored port on the switches, so that not in addition to the traffic that is going to the security gateway, you can actually monitor the traffic that's going between the IEDs. Typically in a substation, like in a transmission type substation, you'd have less than 20, 25, well, let's just say less than 30 devices. And substation switches, utility grade switches, typically have 24 port switches. They're not uncommon. Most vendors make them. Some make 48 port. And so the mirrored port on one or two switches would feed a lot of traffic to the IDS. The idea, though, is you want as much traffic as possible. Now, there will be blind spots in the network, or potential blind spots in the network, but there's another technology. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the symposium that I mentioned earlier, the Canadian Protection Symposium. That's coming up on November 30th. And there, what you could use is SDN, software-defined networking. With software-defined networking, you can not only configure your flows from source to destination, that's the communication from source to destination, but you can also configure a copy of that going to the IDS. So in that particular case, all traffic goes to the IDS. But in most cases, just with the mirrored ports, you're going to get, if not all the traffic, the vast majority of it, and there's the likelihood of you missing traffic from a device, a rogue device or device generating traffic on the network that it shouldn't is exceptionally low. Excellent question.
Awesome, thanks for that great answer. All right, more questions flowing in. Steele, will you be able to share comments or thoughts on network segmentation in a substation and how practical this would be?
Network segmentation, okay. IED to IED, you don't, at the lowest level, the IEDs that are exchanging goose messages, right there, the availability is number one. You're not going to segment there. But then what you're going to do is from those IEDs, there is going to be an RTU connected up to gather data, to bring it upstream and bring it downstream. There is a point right there where you can do network segmentation, right there at that point, okay? And there, the main concern between the RTU and the devices is authentication. Okay, so that's one layer right there. Then you go from the RTU, you could feed the HMI, but you could also feed upstream through to the control center. And in that case, you're going to, of course, not only you've got a segmentation there, but you also want to encrypt as you go outside the substation to the control center. Okay, so it's definitely very practical. In addition to that, what you can have on your substation bus is you can have a security appliance, something like LDAP, where you log into the device and that device acts as a proxy to actually log into the relays themselves. You don't really know what the password is on those relays. You only know your password to get into these security appliances. And these appliances are manufactured by IED vendors in particular. And so you only know your passwords, and if you're a maintenance personnel, you may be given your credentials and only allowed access for a period of time. So that's another example if you're not going to use the DMZ approach, but I really suggest that you use the DMZ approach where you log into actually a computer that is on the network, and you actually are a PC through a virtual machine that's on the network, and you basically remote into it and do all the work through that. You don't actually bring PCs in. Okay, so it is practical that it has to be policies and procedures have to be put in place.
Fair comment, thank you. And follow-up question, how well would this IDS work with IEC 62351?
Okay, what I was talking about, the problem that you're running into now, I believe that's encryption. When we're talking about, if you take a look at that standard, they're talking about encryption when it comes to, they're talking about the encryption when it comes to communication, not like slow speed communication, client server type communication, not peer-to-peer communication, such as you would see goose messaging, which is under 3 milliseconds. So that's, you're not really going to want to encrypt there. It makes it difficult to determine problems on the network, things of that nature. I know that encryption is being thrown around, but the implementation of encryption is difficult to do. And in the case of, it actually even states that in the case of goose messaging, things under a latency under 3 milliseconds, that you really shouldn't be employing it. So all you're going to be doing is encryption for the client server type communications. And I mean, absolutely, you can employ that, but it would only be for client server. But there's a way of doing you're adding within the standard, adding what I call a fingerprint to it without encrypting, so you can actually do verification without encryption. And I think that would be the route to go, rather than just a full encryption on the data.
Perfect. So is in using encryption, is it recommended for goose and sampled value traffic?
No, it's not. It actually states it. Because that goose and sample values, goose is probably going to be, actually in the standards, going to be under 3 milliseconds. And in the case of sample values, it's only going to be a couple hundred microseconds that you're going to want to have maximum latency on the network. And so that's well below 3 milliseconds. So you don't want to slow down that sort of traffic. You really don't want to slow it down.
Understood. Perfect. Well, I think that is all the questions that we had for today. Maybe I'll ask one last push for questions if there are any before we close off. And while we wait for that, Steele, is there anything that you'd like to leave our audience with? Any final thoughts or comments?
No, well, attacks in the OT space we've been warning about it for a long period of time. Unfortunately, it takes attacks like what we saw in the Ukraine or the Colonial Pipeline to really raise awareness. It's a lot of what is being written with NIST, the NIST standards, the concept of layered security, and the NERC-CIP. It's just good practice. It's good practice. The IT world has had it for insurance companies and banks for many, many years, and your corporate IT. And now we need to bring that into the substation. We really do. We really have to engineer our networks within the substation, because I think we're going to see the frequency of these attacks increase as they have been trending up over time. And some of these attacks we believe are nation-state sponsored attacks. We're in a bit of a war, cyber war. Have to recognize.
Yeah, no, that's totally accurate, and it's a tricky time. So if you can be careful and take as many precautions, then why not? So no, thank you very much, Steele. I really appreciate your thoughts and your presentation. I think it's very helpful for our audience today. I think we'll end it here. Before we do step off, I'd like to remind our audience of our upcoming webinars. On Thursday, November 18th, we're going to have Utilicists, who are going to present on building a strong foundation for analytics. And on Thursday, December 2nd, Salesforce will join us for transforming from a hydro distributor to an energy partner. So that should be an interesting topic as well. Again, you can visit electricity.ca, which is CA's website, to see all of CA's future events and webinars. And in closing, again, I would very much like to thank OMICRON and Steele for their time today and sharing this great presentation. Everybody take care, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.
Bye now.